Today, this is our fifth webinar, and we're talking about 1530 apologetics. We want students to intellectually think about who they are and how they live their lives, and does it make sense? And we know that when they get into their first year of college, that there are many questions that they're wondering about. How true are they? Do I have the foundation to stand on my worldview? And one of these questions is about slavery. And I believe it's one of the huge topics of the day for the atheist, for the skeptic. And I don't want to sit here and try to whitewash everything, but I really want to dive into the word, dive into 1300 BC, and talk about slavery, slave, servanthood, being a servant. The word we get from there, and let's jump into this. So the word is called abed in the Hebrew language, and we find out that 85% of the time, the context of the word is talking about a servant, a bond servant. And then you have those few times, I believe there might be 20, 25 times, where it does bring up the word slave into it. So the context does matter when we're talking about slavery. I want to compare it. I want to compare the nations around Israel in 1300 BC, a very primitive time for them, trying to figure out how to deal with society and the things around them. You got the nations abroad that they're not to hang around with. And then how we look at it when it comes to the antebellum South, and when we look at the Atlantic trade of slavery that was going on and the European trade that was going on, that was actually chattel people that had no rights. To them, they had no dignity. They weren't personified as personhood, but they were just property. Property that you would just have to do whatever you wanted to do with. And so we're comparing this topic, slavery, and seeing where it stands as we weigh it out with facts and truth. Now, after all that's said and done, we need to remember that at the end of the day, there's over 40 million slaves today in our global system. That's besides all the trafficking and everything else that's going on in the global society. That's a lot of people that are still in slavery. For how many people say they hate slavery, and yet it's going on like a blind eye. Let's get down and talk about Israel in the 1300 BC. Remember, very primitive time. And this is key, guys, that when God came to Israel, as we learned in other past webinars, when God came to a people, He didn't come to gather the whole nations, all the world together, and begin to tell them how they ought to be living their lives. He picked a people, He called them the Israelites, and now He's beginning to tell them how to live their lives. And as He works, He doesn't just decide, oh, we're just going to start brand new here. No, He always works with the culture. He always works with the system of governing things around the environment that they're living in. And so He has to deal with sinful mankind. He has to deal with people living the way they live in a very primitive society in 1300 BC. Now, when the Mosaic Law was given to Moses, we need to understand that first it was the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue. And this Decalogue would be an everlasting 10 Commandments that would last through all earth's time of humankind, to tell them about the nature of God and His attributes, the 10 Commandments. But then you had the governing laws and the civil laws that were out there, and these would most of the time pertain to the way they lived in that day and as they moved forward. But we find a lot of those civil laws, a lot of those governing laws were taken away as we get into the New Testament. It was for a nation, it was for a people. And then you had the ceremonial laws. The ceremonial laws, we know in the New Testament, they were shadows of things to come. But God was revealing Himself, and slowly, as He revealed Himself to national Israel, he was now he was going to reveal to them how things were going to be and how they didn't understand everything, but how things were going to change as God would begin to work from a nation to now to individuals. But we'll get to that in a moment. The Mosaic Law was not the beginnings or the originator of slavery. In fact, the whole world engaged in the custom of slavery in one form or another. The practice of slavery was put in place by human society. We need to see that. It was a human construct that everyone dove into. Now, as God would put concessions, as he would begin to regulate what was already practiced, we see this when we talk about marriage. As Jesus was a historical figure, and in the first century, it was the religious rulers of the day said, why did Moses get the certificate of divorce? And so now we find Jesus explaining what had taken place, and this is what he said. Listen to this. He said, "Have you not read that God which made them at the beginning, he made male and female. And for this cause the man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And what God has joined together, let no man put asunder, or let them not separate it." But then he goes on to say, and this is key, he goes on to say, "It was because the hardness of your heart that I had to put some concessions down, that you can have a certificate of a divorce. But from the beginning," he says, "it was not so." So he didn't approve of divorce the way they had it back then. But he made some concessions in there. And so we see this with the word slavery or slave or a servant. We see the same thing going on. Now, God never condoned slavery, but he began to set some rules in play for the practice of the world, what was happening already in the world around them. Now, let's think about this, okay, as we think about slavery, Slavery was never a race-based servitude. In other words, it wasn't because of the color of your skin, it wasn't because you were a sub-creature that they begin to put slavery and praise national Israel when they first started this. It wasn't a race-based servitude. Rather, it helped the poor, it helped those in need. Listen, there was many situations, many complications that were going on in a primitive time. They could have complications, disaster, famine, sickness, diseases, and even death. And then what would happen when those cases came about? So we need to remember there were no homeless institutions. There were no orphan homes for kids. There wasn't even no prisons at the time for the people who wronged the civil law, the government. And so we see for the homeless, a situation could take place where even a stranger in the nations around them could be living with a group of people, and someone came and ravished their territory, took everything, took the men with them, left a few women with children there, and that somehow got away. And now they couldn't just start living out there in a land out in the middle of nowhere. They had to go find shelter somewhere. They had to go find a safe place, a place that they could actually eat and work and get help. And this is where it came into play, that someone would take them in, and this is where you get the indentured servitude. Now, the word indentured means it was a contract. It was a contract for either a debt or something that was going to take place. We see this a lot with sports people. They're in a contract, and sometimes a higher bidder will want them, and they give it off to the higher bidder, or they don't want them no more. They give the contract to someone else. That player has to move along if he wants to be playing in that field that he's playing in that sport. So that's indentured, where you owe a debt. Servitude is where you're submissive to the landlord, to that who is the authority of the house, who's taking care of it. He brings you in, you're submitted to him until you pay that debt, whatever that debt may be. And they didn't have no jails there. Okay, so there was no jails. So people who broke the civil law or the government rules, those people would have to pay their debt. If they killed the ox on accident, they burnt down homes, they got mad and they destroyed some stuff, the judges in the city, the judges in wherever they're living would come out and they would make a decision. And if you owed a debt and you didn't have the money, what you would have to go and work. You would have to go in there and pay the price for your debt of causing those actions. A lot of the POWs, prisoners of war, if they went and fought a battle, these guys were enemies of the state. They fought a battle. Israel won, just like any other nation would. You don't just let the prisoners go free. You know, if you have a large army, yeah, of course, let them stay in the land, put the army around it, and you watch over them as they build that city up. But in those days, in 1300 BC, that's not where Israel was at. They would have to take these POWs, prisoners of war, and you had two choices. You either kill them all, or you assimilate them. Even as we got to the first century, it wasn't like God grabbed all the Christians and said, listen, these nations aren't practicing social justice, so we're going to make a stampede. We're going to grab people, make a protest, and we're going to go up to these nations and tell them they're doing it all wrong, and we're going to straighten it all out. That's not what happened in this time. But God had other plans in mind as he began to work with his people. Remember, he's dealing with his people, and yet society, he has to deal with the nations around him too of what's going on.